Hello there guys, what is going on? Daniel Childs back here again for another show. Hope you're doing well. Glad to say we've got another brilliant guest on the podcast today to break down some Chelsea stuff, and this is a guest I've wanted to have on the show for some time, so very glad to link up and have this conversation, and hope you enjoy watching and listening to it. Rob Pratley, RJP Journalism on Twitter. I'm sure a lot of you guys have either followed his work or know of him. He's done a lot of work around Chelsea, also the women's game too, so definitely go and check out that side. But of course today we're going to be focusing more on the men's side in transfer news. But he's worked really hard. I think he has a lot of great information around Chelsea, reporting and also dissecting the reality behind transfer business that I do think is pretty interesting for those of us who do find it a little bit more complex. So we'll get in some Chelsea stuff. The first part of our conversation is more around outgoings. We speak about Mason Mount. We speak about sort of Chelsea's plans for the transfer window. And then in the second part of the conversation, we get more into those big targets that could be arriving at Stamford Bridge this summer. Please do hit that subscribe button on YouTube. Hit the like button too. Helps more people find the content. If you are listening on the podcast feed and do enjoy the show, please do give us a positive rating review. It really does help out as well. But let's get to the show right now. Rob, thank you so much for joining me today on the show. It's always mad with Chelsea, even in the off-season, but are you enjoying a little bit of a break after what turned out to be a pretty miserable season?
Yeah, certainly I should clarify, miserable season from the men's point of view. From the women's point of view, I had a great year. And I will always sort of very much stress that. But yeah, it's nice, I think, just to have a bit of time off. And I also think it's nice that we're not catapulting straight into sort of an international tournament. We have a little bit of a break before the Women's World Cup. There's obviously no immediate men's Euros this year. There's the under-21s, but there's nothing really jumping out before pre-season. So it kind of feels like for the first time in a long time for me, there is actually a break in between the sort of seasons.
Recently, the ownership group, that was a statement that they released on the Chelsea website, kind of addressing the frustrations, giving praise to the women's team. Of course, as you've just said, had a brilliant season once again, 4 successive WSL title, FA Cup win, development in the Champions League too. But I guess from the men's side, there has been obviously a lot of criticism of the way the new ownership has handled things over the past year with the way it's gone. Was it a case of them that it's kind of one of these no-win situations, because they were never going to come out and say, we're idiots, we're sorry, get down on their knees and basically beg for apology? It's never going to work like that. But then if they didn't say anything, there's criticism of that lack of communication. So I guess it's a difficult one.
Yeah, precisely that. I mean, a couple of weeks sort of before that, I did my sort of piece on the sort of place I write, suggesting, let's see some more open communication. And certainly people I've spoken to internally within the club, both at sort of a football level, but also from a more administrative level, was sort of saying there's been a real push to try and encourage us and try and be more open and communicative and try and be more sort of objective in that regard, as opposed to previously with the previous ownership where it was quite sort of clandestine. And obviously you would get the usual statements from sort of Marina, Bruce Buck when players were signed, but you wouldn't really hear anything else outside of that. Certainly, I think the new ownership had to come out and address everything, because it's been a pretty hellish first year for any new ownership in charge of a sort of a successful sporting franchise. That said, I think also they kind of took the fall for the fact there was a lot of stuff behind the scenes that hadn't been right for a long time. And, I sort of talk about it, Chelsea and Manchester City in that regard. Manchester City's reason why they've built for long-term success is because they prioritised that at the very, very beginning. And they built up the structure around, here's what we're going to be doing, we're going to be able to dominate from a sort of period of 10 years on from when we take over, we're going to be in a position to dominate. Chelsea, in contrast, were in a sort of earlier situation. They sort of were the first, big takeover, as per se. And so consequently, I think the way of they operating was sort of a little bit different. There was more of a focus on the fact that, money can achieve anything. And I think nowadays it's being proven that that isn't necessarily true. Having a lot of, cash doesn't necessarily mean you're bound for success. And it also means you have to spend it better. And I do think certainly in the open letter, there was an acknowledgement that maybe, a lot of activity certainly last summer wasn't very sensible activity. I will say that from that period, they do seem to have learned their lesson. A lot more of the transfer business does seem to be more solid and sensible moves. Obviously, the January signings of, I think the jury's out on Mudryk, but for example, Madueke, Badiashile, and Enzo Fernandez all look like good signings. Obviously, we've not seen much of Andre Santos at first team level yet, but he looks like a sort of, the sort of player that could turn out to be an impressive signing. Kendry Payeth, obviously, again, another player for the future. Looks like someone that could be quite a special sort of player. So I think certainly there's been improvement in that regard. But now, obviously, you have to back up those words, talk is cheap. The actions now in this window and ongoing need to really dictate it. Certainly what is being said on sort of, both to me on a personal level, but also more widely in the media, I think is definitely showing they're trying to change that mode of approach.
Do you think that's also an admission of kind of failure with the contract length for Mauricio Pochettino being 2+1 rather than the massive commitment of 5 years to Graham Potter? Obviously, there are two sides to that negotiation, but I felt when I saw that statement when Pochettino was announced, it kind of felt like an admission of maybe you can't go as hard on that full kind of long-term commitment.
Yeah, no, definitely that. And I think it was also maybe a bit of an sort of acknowledgement that obviously there were grand plans and long-term structures put in place under Graham Potter. And indeed, some of the people I still speak to at the club do sort of say that it was a case that if results, and in hindsight, maybe they'd have been better waiting until the end of the season and seeing what the sort of lie of the land was at the end of the season. But certainly, I think there was a feeling from a lot of people, and especially from people that have significant influence in the club, that Graham Potter, they thought he was about to grow into the role, but didn't necessarily show the aptitude and the ability to do that in the short amount of time, and indeed with what was expected of him. Now, with Mauricio Pochettino, you've got someone that's a completely different situation. You've got someone effectively that has almost been there, done that in the Premier League. Has obviously had a period at Tottenham Hotspur where he's guided them to what is their sort of most notable Premier League successes, albeit without winning sort of silverware, and then subsequently has gone and managed at Paris Saint-Germain. Obviously won silver at Paris Saint-Germain, although not necessarily as much as people would expect. That said, you can also point to the fact that he did sort of, take PSG to significant sort of heights, and I think we're now seeing, PSG is a complete circus of a club sort of from a managerial perspective. So it's not really something that you can sort of, I think, judge a manager on. You look at Thomas Tuchel, for example, who failed at PSG, and obviously has proven himself to be, a much more adept tactical manager and a more astute tactical manager. So I think certainly sort of the owners maybe hedging their bets a little bit on Pochettino with the contract length. That said, there has always been, and it's been sort of stressed to me continually, there is always scope that if it starts well, then there's, plenty of opportunity to expand this and move the contracts, move the length forward. It's more of a case, I think, to go for something shorter in the short term so you can sort of see how well they adapt, and indeed if it is the right sort of way, because ultimately Chelsea are in that period of sort of limbo at this moment in time where they have to rebuild and have to restructure.
Yeah, I do think, and I said this on my show today, Pochettino was finally announced. I said if he gets to that stage where he's getting that +1, things have obviously gone very well. You've got to assume that if he's got to that point, given the nature of Chelsea head coaches and the short life cycle of them, we've got to a good stage with him.
Yes.
I do wonder with the ownership, because a lot of the accusations and criticisms have been made of them over the past year is out of their depth, particularly with Bowley being so public last summer, and also from supporters, I guess, rather than outsiders, in terms of why did you try and break something that, fix, sorry, that wasn't broken to begin with? I mean, I think, as you explained earlier, there is something more complex there. And there were criticisms to be had of the previous ownership that have contributed to what we've seen this season, because I think some people have tried to make out that the failings this season are purely because of the change in ownership rather than in my opinion, I don't know if you agree, a longer term sort of downward trend at Chelsea. A lot of problems coming to a head this season.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And I think people didn't necessarily realise that a lot of the time things were being crowded over and sort of papered over with sort of various trophies and silverware, but there was, just certain fundamentals within the club from at all levels, really, that was sort of, historically were fine, but with the nature of how football's moved, and in particular how it's moved in the last decade, it was starting to severely become obsolete.
Yeah, I do agree, and I think that hopefully there have been lessons learned that needed to be learned. I think there's been fair criticism that you can have of the current ownership, but there were also things that needed to be put in place that hopefully
Mhm.
we will see a more coherent approach moving forward. On the transfer approach, I know you've been sort of tweeting about this in the past week and kind of detailing that, there maybe needs to be a bit of a reality check this summer for Chelsea fans in terms of wanting that to indulge in more superstar names that haven't really worked out for Chelsea, and also the reality that Chelsea, because of FFP regulations, are going to have to sell quite a few players. Just want to talk through that in terms of the reality, because I know that the dopamine hit and the obsession with transfers means people always want these big names. But kind of, in my opinion, Chelsea should be focusing on competence this summer and things that are actually going to make us a more effective team.
Yes, no, I agree. And I think there's a tendency in all sort of transfers to people to look at players and look at the sort of name just in terms of who they are and what they are valued at and who they've played for, rather than how well they fit in. I'd sort of said this a few weeks ago when I was sort of advocating not necessarily going for some of the biggest names. In recent years, when Chelsea have bought the biggest names, and maybe I'd say in the last couple of years, the exceptions being Enzo Fernandez and going back to maybe N'Golo Conte, if we're going back, that far. Those two are the names where you've looked at big names, you've brought in big names, and they've actually really succeeded. I'm not really counting Thiago Silva in this because Thiago Silva was obviously a free transfer. People like Ben Chilwell, I wouldn't necessarily say Chilwell was a big name at the time. He's obviously done quite well since joining. But when you're looking at the likes of sort of Timo Werner, as much as I love the guy, people had higher expectations for him. Didn't work out. Hakim Ziyech, a lot of people were saying he was the best thing since sliced bread. Hasn't worked out. Christian Pulisic, there's clearly a lot of talent there, but can't stay fit and has no consistency. Hasn't worked out. Romelu Lukaku, I don't need to spend enough time going on that. Even in the last year, Raheem Sterling, I think very much the jury is still out on the player. Is he sort of, is his best years behind him? Kalidou Koulibaly doesn't look suited to the English game at all. Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, I don't think, I need to go into it. When Chelsea tended to buy the players that are, the lesser names, going back to example January, no one had Benoit Badiashile top of their list at the beginning of January and said, you know what, we should go out and buy Benoit Badiashile. Besides, the club had scattered him for a long, long time. Like, this was not new interest, but no one had him top of the list. Noni Madueke. At the beginning of the month, no one was advocating for Noni Madueke to be the right wing signing. If you go back, sort of even further than this, last summer, at the beginning of the summer, if you said that central midfielder, people weren't saying, let's go get Carney Chukwuemeka. Edouard Mendy, for example, people weren't necessarily putting him top of their goalkeeping targets a few years ago. So going, back even a long, long time further, absolutely Victor Moses and, Cesar Azpilicueta were completely unheralded in that sort of 2021 window, which admittedly was a very, very strong window, but ultimately they became two of, absolutely integral fulcrums, A, one for a title-winning season, and B, also then for the next decade at the club. Now, I think a lot of the time Chelsea are better off looking for the names that aren't the common names. They're looking for the names that aren't the, necessarily the big stars, and the players that can come in and become big stars. When we buy big stars, it doesn't tend to work out. And of course, there are the exceptions to that, but in the last decade, I can maybe think of, off my head, maybe 5 or 6 players that were well-established players that came in, and they came in immediately and flitted in. And even going back to when you had years where transfers looked sensible. Obviously, Chelsea brought Felipe Luis in, and it looked like a really sensible left-back transfer, a top left-back, and didn't settle and didn't work out. When Chelsea go for those big-name players, they have to be the right players.
Yeah, and I think the mess of kind of squad building that we've seen, I don't know if you can even call it squad building in the past 5 years in terms of expenditure, in terms of different players and coaches with various ideals and what they want their team to play like. It has been confusing, and I do agree with you that you look at kind of that 30 to 40 kind of bracket in a fee. If we want to simplify it, it sometimes feels like that's maybe a sweet spot for Chelsea players. I know obviously we've seen inflation in the market, and when you look at players like Diego Costa and N'Golo Kante, arguably the two most successful signings Chelsea have had in the past decade or so. Both of those, I think, were release clauses, weren't they? So sometimes, obviously Chelsea have moved quickly and swiftly, and I felt that's what the previous ownership in those years did very effectively. But in terms of looking at targets now, in terms of moving forward, I think actually let's look at the players to sell. I feel like we don't want to rattle through all of them because a lot of them are quite obvious to us in terms of who should be sold, who should not be sold. I do want to briefly touch on Mason Mount actually, in terms of what's going on with him. And I wrote a piece
Mhm.
for Football London this week in terms of maybe just my frustration. And maybe you can explain this and maybe debunk this in terms of Chelsea pricing Mount highly to
Mhm.
Manchester United, reportedly, and valuing him quite highly in terms of a fee, in terms of what they'd want to sell him for to Man United this summer,
Mhm.
but not valuing him as highly to offer him a new contract to keep him at the club. That, to me, and I know to others, is a bit confusing.
Yeah, no, I do understand that, and again, I think like I don't really want to delve too deep into the Mount situation because there's a lot of stuff from all parties with Mount that's coming out into the public domain. And in reality, the only people that really know the absolute truth
Hmm.
are Mason Mount and the club directors who he's speaking to. And like, I don't want to pretend there's no one journalist has the exact full picture. And a lot of the time, journalists are getting a story from one party and getting a complete different story from the other party, and they've got to try and meld them together. Now, from what I understand with Mason Mount, there have been a lot of issues with negotiations, especially over the last 12 months. Realistically, I'd go back even further. I say it was a real failure of the old ownership to not tie him down right after the Champions League final. I think that was the time you sat down and really had to negotiate. From what I understand, at the time, Mount and his camp were happy to sit down. The club said, let's wait for sort of 6 months. Got to Christmas, they said, let's wait for another 6 months. Got to sort of after that had happened and got to the point where we had the sort of Club World Cup sort of situation. We're ready to sit down. Sanctions obviously then hit. And then subsequently, you're then going back into it and dealing with a completely different team. And, last summer there were conversations. Nothing was really like set in stone, but there were good feelings around it. And from what I understand, there was an offer sort of made before the World Cup, which wasn't signed for whatever reason, that was, extremely close. It was at a point literally where they were like, yeah, we're just ready to get the final signatures on this. That then offer then seems to have disappeared off the table. Following the World Cup, there seems to have been some initial conversations in sort of January, February that don't seem to have really led anywhere. And now it's sort of at a standstill. Now, from my perspective and from what I understand, Pochettino has sort of spoken to the player a little bit, but feels like his mind is made up and he wants to go. From Chelsea's perspective, they want to make sure they get fair value for the player, and they view fair value as being, a significant fee, sort of 60 to 70 million. The suitors that want to buy him view him a much lower rate because of the fact he's been injured a lot this year, and also due to the fact they feel he's been lost on form. And Chelsea aren't sort of necessarily trying actively to sell the player. They want to sell him if someone meets the valuation, but they aren't necessarily against him keeping him. They have other options they can sell. So I think you're kind of in that potential limbo. And the more and more this sort of drags on, the more and more frustrated Manchester United are getting because they were expecting the valuation to drop, but it isn't. It's sort of just staying steadfast at the same level. Now, whether one side just, balks and says, okay, we'll either meet the asking price or Chelsea drop the asking price, I think a lot depends on the conversations that I had with, Mason Mount and his camp. Now,
Mm.
what I will say is that Chelsea aren't necessarily reluctant to offer a significant wage. What they are reluctant to do is really break the sort of wage structure. Now, with Reece James, the reason why it's on such a high structure is because it's such a long deal and they don't anticipate any further negotiations. Certainly, from what I understand, conversations with Mount, they were around a shorter deal, and the sort of suggestion was then we can then negotiate it up further in the future. And the club don't really want to be in a situation where they have a couple of players on significantly higher wages than everyone else, unless they are the absolute creme de la creme and the absolute top players in their position in the world. And the club feel they have got with James. They don't necessarily feel they have that with Mason Mount at
Mm.
this moment in time. And whether that's rightly or wrong, I don't know. Only time will tell. Certainly, I've also been told by some people there's a bit of a fear with Mount that because of the amount of football he's played at such a young age and the lack of breaks he's had, that he's suffering burnout and it's going to effectively be an issue throughout the entire career. Again, whether that's the case, I don't know. But certainly what he values himself at and what the club made offers at, they aren't necessarily dissimilar, but it's the way that things are being transacted, I think, is the problem.
Yeah, I do stress, and I absolutely understand in terms of the contract thing. I mean, I feel that unfortunately, with the 24/7 kind of nature of transfer speculation and reporting now, I feel that contract negotiations are becoming a lot more toxic in terms of the way they're received online.
Yeah.
I feel a lot of sympathy for the player now, in terms of how I see the reaction in terms of if a player dares to reject one contract proposal. And this is kind of a broader issue. This is not just about Mason Mount, but I do fear what are the kind of the tussle, the natural tussle that always took place before in terms of getting a proposal, rejecting that proposal, having negotiations, talking through them as you'd expect, and this being drip fed out to the media. And then, of course, it becomes kind of more public. And I don't think that helps the discourse around a player because they're kind of vilified into and being made to look like they're traitorous for daring to reject an initial proposal. And I say, I'm not saying that specifically to Mount. I'm saying it's just a broader trend I've seen and do concern with in terms of the way players are treated now with these contract negotiations. Because as you rightly say, there's a real nuance here, and there will be briefing, counter briefing. I just sometimes, as much as people talk about player power, I do concern about with an individual player and a club, particularly one of the biggest clubs, and social media power that creates tribalism. I know we're going into a different subject here, but I do just want to stress that. And I don't know if you have anything to add on that, because that is a concern of mine in the way we discuss these issues in the future.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think from my perspective, it is contract negotiations, and I've always said this should be completed solemnly. They should be done in private, and you shouldn't really sort of see a lot of breaks on it. I think when you get to a point when a contract is done, at that point it's okay for it to sort of be breaking out. But I don't like these situations where they're playing out in the media and it's so and so saying X is rejected this, and Y is saying, well, actually it was this. I think in general, and this isn't just at Chelsea, this is at all clubs, I think it's better if they can try and keep it internally and manage it internally. Now, I know that also goes completely against me from a journalistic principle because I want to try and get the stories. But at the same time, things like contracts and stuff, I don't necessarily think there's much of necessarily a useful story in that. And it just results in, as you said, it results in toxicity. It results in a bit of a culture war where people just say, well, why aren't they accepting X? Why aren't they taking Y? And in reality, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The numbers, because they're so high, it's hard to sort of deal with. I find it hard to comprehend some of the numbers because of how high they are. But I'm not going to sit back and say to a player, yes, they should accept X, Y, and Z deal, when in reality, if they've got, double the wages on offer from somewhere else, it's going to affect you. And, I'm not going to try and pretend it. If I, in my day-to-day job, if a rival company comes along and says to me, hey, we'll double your wages to come and work for us, it's going to affect you. It's going to, it's going to be involved in your thoughts. Or if, you feel a company isn't valuing you enough and someone else has actually come here and will give you a bigger role, then, it's going to affect you. It's going to be a thing you think about. And I think people far too often take quite a blasé sort of view of it, of that every player should just, be bound to accept whatever is put on the table. And that, quite frankly, isn't the case.